Welcome to F4 Talks. Today we'll be discussing Andy Burnham. With me is Kent Jenkins, a star journalist, or rather former journalist of the Washington Post, who knows a lot about politics and class in politics. I, of course, am the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. I grew up in India in a political family. I know a thing or two about class in politics. I left India to be a scholar at Oxford, where I debated. And because I've spent a bit of my life, or the formative bit of my life in some ways, in the UK, I too know a thing or two about class in politics. And of course, I do know a wee bit about British politics. Without further ado, we will get cracking on Andy Burnham. Kent, welcome.
Thank you, Atul. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you, Kent. Now, you've written a magnificent piece, which we've published today. And today is the 8th of July, 2026. It is my mother's birthday, so it is a big day in our family. I wouldn't be around if my mother wouldn't be around. So let's get cracking on the story of Kent Jenkins. He's the 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. Prime Ministers, in particular, one of them, Liz Truss, had the shelf life of a lettuce. Rishi Sunak didn't last too long either. And nor did Keir Starmer. So if you're not British, why should you even pay attention to this chap called Andy Burnham?
Atul, it's a very good question. You know, prime ministers for the last decade have come and gone and kind of left barely a trace behind them. But Andy Burnham, upon taking office, is very much unlike his predecessors in some really important ways. 3 important ways, actually. One of them is personally. His biography is very different than any of his predecessors, not just his immediate predecessors, but his predecessors from some time. British prime ministers tend to come from the elite, the social elite, the educational elite. Andy Burnham does not. He is a child of the middle or working class. He did attend Cambridge, but he's the first in his family to attend university.
So let me stop you just very quickly for a moment and give a shout out to your piece, to your magnificent piece, in which you talk about this, and we published it today on the 8th of July, or July 8th for our American friends, in which you talk about Andy's Cambridge experience. Over to you. Please continue.
And we'll get to that, but he's not a typical prime minister in terms of his bio. He's also not a typical prime minister in terms of his political background. He was just elected to Parliament a few weeks ago, and he spent the last almost decade as the mayor of Manchester. Manchester and Liverpool are from England's north, a very post-industrial, economically depressed area. We Americans would refer to it as being analogous to our Rust Belt. He was mayor of that city for a decade. I don't know that there's any precedent for a mayor ascending to prime minister. It's particularly one from Manchester. So that makes him different. And the last key difference is his policies are quite different than all his predecessors. But because of some of the things that he's accomplished over the last 10 years as mayor of Manchester, he's not only become significantly popular, and so popular that he is ascending to the premiership, but he's done some very, very different things, and he's put together really a pretty coherent package of reforms that have already been dubbed Manchesterism around the country. That's a very, very strange name for a package of policies in British politics. Again, Manchester is not normally the place that London looks to take political guidance.
So now, importantly, let me interrupt you very quickly. John Major, his parents worked in a circus, apparently were trapeze artists. He didn't even go to university. In fact, his predecessor, Maggie Thatcher, was a grocer's daughter. if you look at Gordon Brown, he didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He was a minister's son, and that to a Presbyterian from Scotland. Theresa May was also a minister's daughter. Of course, she was Church of England. She grew up leafy and bourgeois, but she wasn't upper class. She didn't go to Cheltenham Ladies, leave aside Eton or Winchester, which are boys' public schools, and public means posh private schools in Britain. And to be fair to Sir Keir Starmer, he is certainly not posh. He's also working class, rather earnest. If you look at the politics of the UK, and if you divide them into cavaliers and roundheads, as I often do, you can see that roundheads do come to power. It is not exactly as ossified as people imagine it to be. Over to you, sir. What do you say to that?
Obviously the history is the history and it's there, but certainly the package of policies that he's put together and he's bringing in are very, very different. And I do think that his particular brand of his particular personal background is unique. It's what's made him popular. And I think that the reason this matters to people, in not just in Britain but beyond, is that this group of policies called Manchesterism is very, very intentionally designed. A lot of the populist currents that not only have controlled British politics for the last decade, but have controlled politics in America and around Western Europe and elsewhere for the last decade. So, the political context here in Britain, begins a decade ago with Brexit, the very earthquake of a referendum in which the people of Britain voted to withdraw their country from the European Union. A few months after that, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, and those kind of currents have controlled politics in those countries, and similar currents have played through Italy, Germany, Brazil, Argentina, a lot of places. And Andy Burnham is one of the first people. He's obviously a Labour prime minister. He comes from a center-left party, and he's one of the first center-left politicians to develop a sort of thoroughgoing project that is an effort to address those currents of right-wing populism. And I think it's going to be very interesting, not merely for the British people to see if what he's trying to do is successful, but for people in the United States and far beyond as well.
All right, so let's address Manchesterism. All right, Manchester for years was a faded post-industrial city. Its time supposedly had come and gone, and now it has enjoyed a renaissance of sorts. So my question to you really is, explain to the viewers, what is Manchesterism, and how did it capture the imagination of at least some people in Great Britain? And a final thing, disclosure, I've been going to Manchester for many years because one of my father's closest friends, Dr. Professor Vijay Kumar Das, who's one of our donors as well, lives in Manchester. So I have experienced the rebound of Manchester as I have arrived by megabus or some other cheap bus from London to Manchester. I haven't gone the posh way, not taking the fast train, although there aren't very many fast trains. And I have seen this, this urban renewal renaissance in Manchester. So, but take it away. Explain all of this to our viewers/listeners. So,
Atul, I think there are two. Manchesterism is both a policy agenda and also a political program. Mm-hmm. And it's the policy agenda is really designed to restructure Britain's national government in a very significant way. The political piece of this is, as we discussed and as I wrote in my piece for Fair Observer, is pretty much a full-on assault on Britain's class system and how society is structured in Britain in many ways.
So, can I just stop you very quickly? That is true today, but do you know Manchesterism, often called the Manchester School in the 19th century, was born right in the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Richard Cobden and John Bright led it. The definitive philosophy of radical free trade, laissez-faire capitalism, and anti-imperialism were the driving force of Manchesterism. And its defining triumph was the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. And The Economist magazine, which I have read since my days at Oxford, began in 1843 to fight the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws actually decreased the price of food and enabled a greater industrialization of Europe in some ways. They harmed the agricultural class. They improved the lot of the working class and indeed industrialists. So it's interesting. Manchesterism has taken a new meaning. Over to you.
It has taken a very new meaning because Manchesterism, at least as defined by Andy Burnham and his good friend and political soulmate, Steve Rotherham, the mayor of nearby Liverpool, is really a reaction to the kind of unfettered free market politics of Margaret Thatcher some several decades ago. As you mentioned, Manchester, for many reasons, not merely the policies of Margaret Thatcher, but because there was a lot of coal mining there. There was a lot of industrial things and a lot of manufacturing, all of which have just been decimated. And Manchester fell on very difficult times. That was the atmosphere that Andy Burnham grew up in. It is very true that in the last 10 to 15 years, Manchester has actually 10 or 20 years begun to have a bit of a renaissance. It has developed an economy that is much more diversified, and that has been changing. But I think Andy Burnham as mayor still very much chafed at a lot of the restrictions that he found that national government put on him. And he very much objected to the legacy of Margaret Thatcher's policies. And frankly, he, almost most of his time as mayor, he was serving under conservative prime ministers, and he had very different ideas about how to do things. And so what he did was a reaction against that. And policy-wise, oddly enough, there's if there's one image that I think propelled Andy Burnham from Manchester back to Westminster and the premiership, it is of all things Manchester city buses, which are a bright yellow. The local bus lines in Manchester and in other major cities were divested from public ownership under Margaret Thatcher, sold off to private companies. And over the years, service got worse and worse while the prices got higher and higher. And there was enormous public discontent about this. And when Burnham became mayor of Manchester 10 years or so ago, one of the things he did was reinstate a franchise system, which enabled city government to take a much more direct control of the buses to improve service. He imposed a maximum fee of £2 or less than $3 to go anywhere in the city. And he made some just very significant tangible improvements in the way the system worked. And he painted all the buses bright yellow just to make sure that wouldn't go unnoticed. And it did not. And it began to build not only a sense of possibility about what government could do in a very cynical time, but it certainly began to build a public image of Andy Burnham as a guy who could get things done.
So if I can add a little bit of color, if you don't mind, to Manchester, because I've been going there for a while and I have some familiarity and friends there. One of the things that people forget is that Manchester attracted a lot of foreign investment. Manchester, during this period, and Andy Burnham does deserve some credit, but maybe some of it was just lower prices because London became too expensive, became a knowledge economy. It became a hub for the knowledge economy. In fact, there is a 2026 report by the Productivity Institute. 54% of Manchester's inward investment value comes from greenfield projects, meaning entirely new operational setups. Birmingham, the figure is 22%, and London just 14%. So who's come there? Amazon, IBM, Booking.com, etc. Okay, information technology, cybersecurity, AI, and life science sectors. Dr. Professor Das is, of course, he's an ENT surgeon, if I remember correctly. He is in the medicine, and he pioneered a new form of surgery. So he's very much a part of that life science element in Manchester. Then what has happened is that you have research and development and data centers. Then the second thing is sovereign wealth has played a huge role in Manchester's revival. The Abu Dhabi United Group, okay, people know it because it owns Manchester City, the most successful football club in England for the last few years. Everyone remembers Manchester City because of Kevin De Bruyne of Belgium, Erling Haaland of Norway, David Silva of Spain, Sergio Aguero of Argentina, Yaya Toure, I'm forgetting which country, the great African player, and we could go on. But the point is, it's much more than Manchester City. The investment revitalized neighborhoods. There's also been a lot of Far Eastern and Middle Eastern capital that has come in. Things like Media City UK in Salford, multi-billion pound transformation near Piccadilly Station, which I have been to, which I've seen firsthand. There's also the Oxford Road corridor. You look at the Bruntwood SciTech, which has specialized life science labs, and that's been helpful. And a great success has been retaining graduates, 50% graduate retention rate. And so what happens is that local academic research turns into commercial enterprise, which is something Oxford has struggled with, to be fair. Oxford is far too much of a tourist and not urban enough. Cambridge has done better, but you have that phenomenon. And then, of course, we have to give credit, where credit is due. The build-to-rent explosion has been financed almost entirely by foreign institutional funds and overseas private buyers, particularly from Asia and GCC, which means there's lots of housing available, unlike London, which has a housing shortage, or Oxford or other places.
And indeed, Atul, I think there are plenty of people in Great Britain who no fans who are critics of Andy Burnham who would say that he's getting credit for a number of things that he had nothing to do with. That, like a lot of good politicians, right place, right time. Yeah. And I think one of the things we're going to find out when he becomes prime minister is to what degree he was a benefit of circumstance, as a beneficiary of circumstances.
So I'm not making that argument, actually, unlike his critics. I have a more nuanced argument. I'm saying that he certainly did some fantastic things. For instance, he certainly made the planning process a bit better. He certainly integrated the region's transport network, buses, trams, and cycling infrastructure under a unified, publicly controlled system, so much so that Pep Guardiola would cycle around Manchester. So he certainly, improved connectivity. So I'm not saying he did nothing. My point is that, yes, he was good, and he rose to fame protesting COVID in his leather jacket, famously on City Hall, speaking out against the then Tory government. But what I'm also saying is that the success is not entirely because of him. He did some things right, but he also rode a wave, but so did Boris. And Boris presided over very successful London Olympics, and Boris was a decent mayor by some accounts. He could not translate that success into a successful prime ministership.
Successful politicians almost always are the beneficiary of good fortune. I like to say, I haven't met a politician yet that can control the waves. Some are just better surfers than others, and Boris did benefit from good fortune. Andy Burnham has had his plane, but I think the larger point, and particularly for our viewers and listeners from outside England, is that the bus service in Manchester may not be something that they care about, but at a moment of enormous public cynicism, when there was great doubt about the ability of any politician anywhere to accomplish anything, Andy Burnham has put together some tangible accomplishments that people have said, I can feel that in my life. I can see that in my life. And it's visible. And it has not only buoyed him politically, it has created a kind of a foundation for him to say, okay, we need to do things differently. We need to see things differently. And in the wake of Donald Trump and Brexitism, when there's been, the spirit of right-wing populism has been, so deeply cynical about government and about the ability of institutions generally to do anything. His ability to kind of put a counter proposal forward to say, no, we can do things, is, I think, one of the things that's going to be most interesting about his premiership. You mentioned COVID earlier, and I think this is where the policy and the politics of Andy Burnham really fit together nicely. During COVID, Andy Burnham was mayor, but, Westminster and Prime Minister Boris Johnson were really calling the shots. And there was a point where, when the lockdowns came, the terms of the COVID lockdown in Manchester were imposed on Andy Burnham by the Prime Minister. And there were also financial decisions made that really were very, very punishing for people in Manchester, all of which emanated from London. And Burnham complained bitterly about it, and very publicly. And there was a famous moment where on TV he really went after Boris Johnson. And one of the things he took away from that is there's too much power vested in Parliament. There's too much power vested in Prime Minister in London. And we should devolve power back to the cities and the independent countries. London should have a great deal less power. And he has vowed to do that as Prime Minister, and it would certainly appear that as he walks in the door, he will have the power, because of a Labour majority to do, or a very powerful Labour bloc to do that. And it's going to be very interesting to see not only the substantive effects of that, but politically, he's making an argument that's pretty unusual for center-left parties and for parties like Labour. And it's saying we should put power back in the hands of people. We should put it near communities. The Brexit campaign 10 years ago, its motto was "Take back control," and there's a very clear echo of this kind of take back control theme, and what Andy Burnham said he wants to do as Prime Minister, and he wants to enable communities can do. That's very unusual coming from the left. And it is going to be interesting to see not only how it succeeds substantively, but how that succeeds politically.
So, one of the things that you mentioned, that Andy wants devolution. Reality is, Andy was very opposed to devolution when he was in London, when he was part of the establishment. This is his third attempt to be leader. I have a video on the fall of Keir Starmer. You've obviously heard it with our dear friend Glenn Carl, straight out of central casting, as you say. And the point I made is he fought in 2010, got 10.4% of the vote. He came second to Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, got 19% of the vote. And he opposed devolution of health services to local leaders as shadow health secretary in 2015. So the allegation against against Andy is that Andy lacks ballast, lacks a clear moral compass. He's a populist. He will sing one tune today, another tomorrow. Be that as it may, I take your point that he's unusual. He's promising devolution in a highly centralized country. Both England and France were the first kingdoms that became very centralized states. Maybe not first. I mean, there was Spain became a nation state, but Spain was always fragmented into regions, and Spain has had civil war and Franco and whatnot. But England and France very much are dominated by London and Paris, respectively. And centralization has been the name of the game, whether it is Maggie Thatcher, whether it is any prime minister since Winston Churchill, 1945. Okay.
And you know, Atul,
please.
No, I was going to say, clearly, and we should talk about this, Andy Burnham had a political career in Parliament, a 20-year political career in Parliament before he became mayor of Manchester. And
yes.
his career clearly is divided into two very significantly different parts.
A tale of two halves.
It is. And Andy Burnham would tell you that when he went home to Manchester and he took the reins of a city where he had to get, where he had
he had a Damascene conversion.
Yes, that he had St. Paul's Damascus Road experience. There are plenty of people that will tell you that there's a whole lot of cynicism in that. Again, we'll find out how.
But I'll stop you there. But even there, he's not unique, because New Labour, once Tony Blair comes to power in 1997, does put devolution on the agenda. They create a Scottish Parliament. They create a Welsh Assembly. There is talk of empowering local mayors, and Andy Burnham profited from New Labour's devolution. Yes, he's unusual, but what I'm trying to establish is he's unusual, but not that unusual. He's also part of a trend. In my view, he's an Oxford man, in the sense that he's the first Cambridge Prime Minister in 90 years. The last guy was Stanley Baldwin.
As an Oxford graduate, that would make him enormously unusual and deeply suspect, I imagine.
Cambridge man. Not
that's
an Oxford
right.
man.
Deeply suspect. But
yes, the University of Communist Spies.
Atul, I fly at a very different altitude than you. I went to the University of North Carolina, but I'm familiar with your regard for Cambridge, because we Tar Heels regard Duke University in very much the same way.
No, I mean, on a serious note, Cambridge has done much better in technology than Oxford. Forget about the jokes about Oxford and Cambridge rivalry. Yeah. Cambridge has profited from creating a tech sector around the city. In fact, the city has grown. Oxford has failed. Part of the reason was Oxford denied Maggie Thatcher an honorary doctorate, and my own tutor was part of that gang that did so. And then Maggie Thatcher, out of spite, and boy, she could hold spite, went on to raise lots of money for Cambridge just to spite Oxford. So Cambridge played its cards better. And even today, for mathematics, for physics, Cambridge is engineering, Cambridge is light years ahead of Oxford. So that is certainly the case. But it is not a university which, since 1945, there have been 15 Oxford prime ministers, if I'm correct. There have been none. You have to go back all the way, I believe, to 1930s for Stanley Baldwin, who was a Tory prime minister. So he's unusual. He's also Catholic. That's important too. Of course, now Britain has had a Hindu prime minister who lighted Diwali candles. Of course, I'm referring to Rishi Sunak. So religion, in some ways, Britain is a post-religious society in some ways. It has moved a far way, or a long way from the days of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, wherein no Catholic would be trusted. And of course, many Catholics, like Sir Thomas More, got the chop.
But Cambridge, and when Andy Burnham has been asked about his personal influences, and he's talked and written about his personal life, he doesn't have a great deal to say about Catholicism being a real major impact on his life. I don't know that I've seen nothing to suggest that it was a real dominant presence in his home or in his psyche. Cambridge, on the other hand, was, and I think it's a very important part of the story, and how he came to Cambridge and what he took away from all that, and what that means, politically, not just to British citizens, but where that goes is very interesting.
Let me interrupt you a little bit. I mean, Andy Burnham did go to a Catholic school.
Yeah.
All right, if I remember correctly. He
did.
Let me look at my notes.
No, he did. He did go to a Catholic school.
Yeah, he did go to a Catholic school. So he was influenced by some form of Catholic
teachings,
he said, Catholic social teaching underpins my politics. We did have to read the catechism at school, but it is powerful and strong and right. Now, one of the things our viewers outside the UK and our listeners outside the UK, viewers and listeners outside the UK should know, is that there are more practicing Catholics today in the UK than people who go to Church of England services. This is a historic shift. This is a profound shift. Even Jacob Rees-Mogg, who pretends to be the 17th or 18th century Tory, is a Catholic with 5 children, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Boris Johnson claimed to be Catholic, true, too. Tony Blair was a crypto-Catholic until he left the prime ministership.
And absolutely, he went to Catholic school. It's not something that he speaks of a lot or a great deal. Whereas Cambridge, on the other hand, was I think a pretty seminal experience for him, and it's worth talking about, because he had neither of his parents went to college. He wrote a book with Steve Rotherham, his good friend, the mayor of Liverpool, a couple of years ago, called Head North. And I must say, political books, particularly books written in anticipation of a campaign, are generally pretty dreary and turgid affairs. This one's actually not a bad read. And one of the stories he tells in Head North is about his first interview at Cambridge. He was aspiring to, Cambridge and Oxford, as you well know, have these semi-autonomous constituent colleges. And he had applied to St. Catherine's College at Cambridge, which was founded in the 15th century. And he describes arriving for his interview and ascending a stone staircase and entering a wood-paneled room and encountering a professor who offers him a glass of sherry. And proceeds to ask him whether he thinks the Canterbury Tales have much in common with a modern package holiday. And Burnham writes in the book that I was still trying to understand that question a few days later when the rejection letter landed on my doorstep. But then he was given a second interview by Fitzwilliam College, which was founded 400 years after St. Catherine's, specifically to admit students who were less privileged and who were not able to attend Cambridge before. And he was indeed accepted. He says that for much of his time, even at Fitzwilliam, he struggled with imposter syndrome, did not feel he belonged there, and continues to do so. I think he has claimed in many ways. And it, again, this, I think, is not only a very entertaining anecdote, it gets to the root of a lot of the class politics that we're talking about here. And it really has cleaved Britain for a long time, but over the last 10 years, you know, the Brexit movement and the right-wing populism that supported it has been a movement of people who were deeply wounded by globalism economically, who live in rural areas outside the major cities, feel disadvantaged, and don't like much at all about any of the British leadership over the last 10 years, and have made that clear. And this is Andy Burnham. You know, I don't think that the stories that he tells are cynical, but this, I think, from a biographical standpoint, positions Burnham to try and connect with a lot of voters who once upon a time would have voted Labour, and who instead now have gone over to vote for Brexit, have voted Conservative, or even for the Reform Party, a splinter party run by Nigel Farage that supported Brexit. We'll talk about that as well. But this Andy Burnham is making a very personal appeal to people across class lines here that in effect says, well, I may kind of read like some of these other guys who've been running things for a long time in a lot of ways, but I'm not. And I'm one of you. And that, I think, is one of the elements of this, that as you begin to look in places like the United States, where the Democratic Party has struggled to come to grips with Trumpism, and other countries, Germany, Italy, who are dealing with these same things, it's going to be very interesting to see how this kind of personal politics, number one, whether or not it succeeds in Britain, because that's very much an open question right now.
Please finish your point.
Whether or not it's going to travel across the Atlantic, if it does succeed, is one of the things that's going to be very curious.
So one of the interesting things when you were talking, I couldn't help smiling, because I have some working class friends who and even middle class friends who've said that the fact that I was from the right class meant that I was treated better, even though I was a foreigner, than them, even though they were British, at Oxford and even in London circles. And this, we've discussed this the very first time we met, and these type of conversations helped me to predict Brexit. As you've read my piece on February 21st February 2016, my brother's birthday, actually.
Literally in our first conversation together, kind of fastened on this as to how it shapes people and how it shapes societies.
Yeah, and in particular Britain, because in some ways India is the most stratified society of the East, and in some ways Britain is the most stratified society of the West. And I have experience in both. And of course, now I live in the US, which is increasingly becoming stratified. So the element of class is certainly important for Andy Burnham. He did rise through, the class ladder. He talks about the imposter syndrome. He went back to his roots, and now he's coming back, as king of the North for his coronation. All of that is true. And he's not an Etonian, unlike David Cameron, unlike not Tony Blair, unlike David Cameron or Boris Johnson. Even Rishi Sunak was prefect at Winchester. So he's a very different kettle of fish. But so, as I pointed out, was Theresa May, and so was Keir Starmer, and so was Jeremy Corbyn, who didn't even go to university. So we've got to bear that in mind as well. Now, let us talk.
Atul, if I can, just one thing too about the class point that I have to point out, that the markers of class and the things that separate people like that. One of the things that initially intrigued me a while back about Andy Burnham was, as an American, I've just grown accustomed to when I see and hear a British Prime Minister speak, I know exactly what I'm going to get, which is that wonderful Oxbridge diction that is so precise and magisterial, and whatever your background kind of conveys, that I'm in charge to get things done. And the first time I heard Andy Burnham speak, he sounds a little bit like Ringo Starr, and he does not.
But he has flattened his vowels deliberately.
Well,
it's also partly an act.
Ringo is what the Liverpool folks call a scouser. I think it's a very, very strong accent, and Andy's not as pronounced.
Andy has a Manchester accent, Mancunian.
Yeah, but it's very much not London. And it grabs you immediately, and it conveys to people, well, this guy's a bit different. He's also doing very, very specific things we can talk about to kind of post billboards that say, I'm different.
Well, he's addressing Britain's, Britain has many fault lines now.
Yep.
Okay. One fault line is, of course, class. One fault line is region. One fault line is religion. Not so much race yet, but race also is race and religion often intersect. So Britain has many fault lines. And what he is trying to do, Andy is trying to do, is address these fault lines and push back on Brexit, push back on Nigel Farage and reform. Because lest we forget, Nigel Farage was the key man who led to Brexit. He ran a phenomenal campaign. He kept the issue alive. And eventually, opportunists like Boris, who admitted to Winston Churchill's grandson that he was not a Brexiteer, and then ran a campaign for Brexit, hoping he would lose and then ascend to the throne.
Boris sort of jumped on the train just as it was leaving the station, as we Americans like to say. Exactly.
And Andy Burnham is certainly trying his best to inherit the mantle of leadership in the Labour Party and keep Labour in government. But he has a tall order. He's got a big task ahead. Why? Because in some ways, if you read the headlines, and I'll read some to you right away. All sorts of headlines. Number one, retailers warn over potential scale of Burnham's proposed warehouse tax. That's one. Burnham rules out splitting treasury to avoid disruption. Burnham warned of unsustainable public finances by UK fiscal watchdog. These are just Financial Times. Okay, fine. Let's go to the BBC. The BBC headline: how a rise in ADHD benefits claims is adding to Andy Burnham's welfare challenge. Why is that important? Because more than 100,000 people are claiming ADHD as their main condition, and they are receiving personal independent payments called PIP. And there's been an increase of 40% since Labour came to power 2 years ago. Now we know that the UK has too much debt. UK is running big deficits, and the UK no longer has the reserve currency of the world. It's now the US, at least for now, until things may change here too. And so the bond market can rebel, and it has. And so what does that mean? That means bond prices go down. That means the interest rates go up. The interest you pay on the bonds, on the money you borrow, go up, which means there's less money for guns and butter. And this is coming at a time when Britain needs to spend more on defense. This is coming at a time when Britain needs to spend more on infrastructure. Infrastructure is creaky and rotting. This comes at a time when Britain privatized its water, and the companies basically have ruined Britain's water supply. They have taken profits today, privatized profits, and socialized losses, or socialized the terrible consequences for future generations. So Andy is inheriting a poison chalice. Over to you.
And there is a great deal that we do not know about Manchesterism and where it's going to go. As they say in the tech industry, we're about to find out whether Manchesterism can scale. It worked in a city, and we don't know if it's going to work at a national level. It's one of the most interesting criticisms, or not, it's not a criticism, it's just a fact. When the issues that Andy Burnham chooses to focus on are, let's give power to the towns and cities to do things like fix the buses. Let's fix education, but let's concentrate on education for the trades and for technical. Let's have a track of public education for people that are not university bound, that is really rigorous and successful. Let's build more council houses, which Americans referred to as public housing. What he said very little or almost nothing about is managing the national economy, or actually managing foreign policy. It's just not the issues that animate him. It's not the issues that he's been dealing with as mayor. It's not the issues that he's focused on. And there are enormous kind of blank spots about where that's going to go. And this has touched one of the more interesting, I think, back and forths in all this is, I think right around the end of May, when it was clear that Burnham was going to be making a run for the premiership and was making a run and gathering steam, none other than Burnham's former boss, Tony Blair, weighed in with a 5,000-word essay that said the Labour Party is playing with fire with Britain's future. And he took some pretty clear shots at Burnham and said, the problem really isn't the Westminster bubble, because that's one of Burnham's favorite catchphrases, that, the problem is centered in Parliament and that bubble down there in Westminster. And he said, the problem is we don't have a plan. And being a former prime minister, he said, I've got a plan. And he put forth a 10-point plan that said we should focus on the AI revolution, and we should, and the,
This is a little rich coming from a man who refused to use a computer and wrote his autobiography by hand. So
yes,
Tony Blair
with focus on incorporating AI and the geopolitical power structure.
And his son runs some fancy tech company, and he's taken Rupert Murdoch's money, and apparently, per rumor, even slept with Rupert Murdoch's wife.
Well, and
there was a former wife, rather, which is why I'm told that he lost funding from good old Rupert. So Tony is a little hard to take. I'm sorry, I have my bias, but
and Tony
is a little hard to digest for me, especially I remember 2003.
And he was a little hard for Andy Burnham to digest too, because Andy Burnham's kind of the word he returns to over and over again is inequality. He wants to address inequality in British society. And nowhere in Blair's essay did he even use the word inequality, nor did he address any of the concerns that, have arisen since the financial crisis of 2008, or that might be ascribed to, globalism, and to some policies, in fact, that date back to the Blair administration. And they've really gone after each other, pretty intensely, but beneath whatever personal issues there are, their argument was less philosophical than it was about worldview, because Tony Blair was looking forward and saying there are all these big things out there that we need to be concentrating on. And Andy Burnham is basically saying, well, there are all these things kind of down here at street level that are affecting the lives of Britons, and we need to fix these things first. And it is unclear, and I think he's sincere about that, and there's some things he's going to do, but we don't know what the state of the British economy is going to be and how much it can support. How many of these spending programs he will be able to afford. We obviously don't know what the future holds with foreign policy. As an American, my president tends to kind of change foreign policy with a dependent clause in a sentence. You just never know what's going to be coming out there. And all these things are things that Burnham will have to address. And we don't really know where that's going to go, but he's made it pretty clear it's not where he's going to choose to spend his time. Where he's going to choose to spend his time and energy when he's able is to change how things work in British society and to address the needs of people who have felt excluded and disadvantaged by recent economic trends, by things of class. And I think it is that set of concerns, which certainly Tony Blair did not voice as prime minister and did not voice in his recent 5,000-word manifesto. It's how how whether or not Labor can succeed in addressing those kind of concerns is, I think, what Americans in the Democratic Party, what potential Democratic candidates for the presidency of the United States in 2 years are going to be watching, and what center-left politicians in many other places around Europe and around the West are going to be watching.
So very quickly, for our viewers and listeners, let me give a historical parallel or historical reference point. Everyone talks about the Reagan Revolution here in the US. People forget that the Thatcherite Revolution or the Thatcher Revolution preceded the Reagan Revolution by a year. Maggie Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, Maggie, the patron saint of the Tory party even today, Thatcher, the milk snatcher for the Labour Party. Maggie came to power a year before Reagan and changed British politics. And at that time, Britain was broken in 1979. The winter of discontent even saw the grave diggers on strike. Public sector was too much of a drag on the economy. Britain, as a South African entrepreneur once told me, was in the gutter before Thatcher came. And she turned it around. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, she did turn a lot of things around. So we have to give credit where credit is due. And there was the parallelism, Ronald Reagan coming and also saying government is the problem. And, you should be careful of the words, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And Maggie Thatcher's famous words, there is no such thing as society. She was basically influenced by Friedrich von Hayek and, of course, Ronald Reagan by Milton Friedman and yada, yada, yada.
And it is very interesting that, there have been at least 3 waves in my lifetime where, America and our mother country have moved in tandem politically. And one was Thatcher and Reagan, who came to power in a conservative revolution. There was a sort of a counter movement to that revolution in neoliberalism, where Bill Clinton, the president of the United States, and Tony Blair came to power at about the same time.
Well, Bill Clinton came to power in 1992. He beat George Bush Sr.
Right.
And 5 years later, Tony Blair came to power in 1997. So Reagan succeeded Thatcher,
sure.
And Tony Blair succeeded Bill Clinton and led to the third wave, which was combining elements of Thatcherism, fusing them with some of the strengths of the left, and creating neoliberal order, a global order.
The third wave was a response to Thatcherism and Reaganism.
Exactly.
And then 10 years ago, you had Brexit,
which preceded Donald Trump this time. Again.
5 or 6 months before the election of Donald Trump,
2016.
That happened at the same time. And Brexit and Trumpism were, I think, a direct response to the third way. I mean, you've had these 3 waves flow through these 2 countries at the same time. And I think what Andy Burnham is trying to do 10 years after Brexit and 10 years after the election of Donald Trump is to put forth a political and policy program that will react in a coherent and comprehensive way to that. Now, that's a very tall order. That is, that's the state of politics in the U.S., Great Britain, and everywhere, which has been chaotic, and trying to turn that ship is really difficult. It's anybody's guess whether Burnham can succeed. But I will say that I think in the 10 years since Brexit and the election of Trump, you can search far and wide for for any real thought out comprehensive program coming from the left of the center left to kind of particularly address voters, working class, middle class voters who have defected from them, and to say, no, here's a reason why you should think differently. And I do think Manchesterism is probably about as close to that as we've seen. And it is going to be a pretty interesting thing to see how successful it will or will not be.
So as an American sitting here, what we're seeing is perhaps Andy Burnham could be left's answer to Donald Trump, to the far right, and could represent a fourth swing. And this time,
that's certainly,
some of the
it
issues
certainly seems to me,
such as wait a minute, wait, I haven't finished. Such as inequality, cost of living, and the disaffection of people in different communities from a more centralized, globalized order.
It certainly seems pretty clear, at least from my comfortable vantage across the Atlantic, that is what he is aspiring to do. And if you look at his political vocabulary,
will he succeed?
And if you look at his
will he succeed? This is my final question.
And I'm going to punt because I think he's going to succeed in changing the political tone of the debate. Because I don't have a crystal ball to predict the economy. I don't know if he is going to have a cooperative enough economy to support the policy initiatives and the programs that he wants to. And I think that is where he could founder. What's your sense?
I think we are headed for a period of economic pain, and I think, unfortunately, when these things happen, like Anthony Eden's words come to mind: "Events, dear boy, events." A lot will depend on events. With the Iran war, with a supply side shock to the economy, with inflation ripping through the economy, with the fact that central banks have printed money like no tomorrow, and governments have spent money like drunken sailors, I think the crown for the King of North is a poisoned chalice. All political careers as a British politician, not very popular these days for his rivers of blood speech, said end in failure. I think Andy Burnham will also end in failure, but it should be a glorious failure. He should at least give it a shot and give it all he has, because the political parties of Britain are fragmenting. You have a lot more political parties, and they represent a more fragmented society. The Labour Party now represents Muslim voters, it represents white working class voters, and it represents the lefty, leafy liberals from many comfortable boroughs. And it is a very unwieldy and odd coalition. They make for very strange bedfellows. So Andy Burnham has a very tall order, and he hasn't showed the stomach for really tough and painful decisions. And whoever comes to power, right or left, will have to take Britain through a lot of pain for the great sunlit uplands that Winston Churchill talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. Just in terms of, is he a skilled politician? I mean, to leave Westminster and Parliament to go to Manchester and now to be kind of coming back in triumph. He's obviously a skilled politician. He's
an extraordinary politician. He's been coronated. He's been coronated as Prime Minister without a leadership battle. It's extraordinary.
He's a skilled politician, and he's made a lot of that happen. He's also had a good deal of luck. And if he's going to be successful as Prime Minister, he's going to need all that skill and even more luck than he's had so far.
Yes, he is a captain taking charge of a ship in the eye of a storm.
Yes.
On that note, Kent Jenkins, what a pleasure. We will be back to discuss many more things. It's great talking with you, and thank you very much for your time. If you've liked this discussion, make sure you like this video, you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you press the bell icon so that you can get notifications, and go to our website, sign up for the newsletter. We bring you perspectives from around the world, from more than 3,000 authors, from over 90 countries, see the light through many prisms, from South Carolina, from North Carolina, I apologize, to Nagaland, which is a state on the northeast, in the northeast of India, bordering Myanmar. So without further ado, bye for now.
Thanks, Atul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.